welcome you all to KIDA. My name is Brooke Everett, and I'm a senior occupational therapist for KIDA. And I am pleased to invite you to the sensory processing and autism lecture, KIDA's innovation series. So I'd let some of you know this already, but lunch was scheduled to run from 1:45 to 12. And now we will begin with introductions. Then I will turn it over to Dr. Erna Blanche, and she will be leading a presentation. And then I will be leading a case study of a video of a child with autism. And then we will end with about 15 minutes for a Q&A. So for introductions, Dr. Erna Blanche has her basic training in OT at the University of Chile, has her master's in special education at Columbia, and her PhD in occupational science at USC. She's an expert in pediatric occupational therapy and interventions based on occupational science. She's co-authored various books on pediatric practice. She's published numerous journals in English and Spanish on the topics of play, wellness, and other issues in clinical practice. She also has lectured internationally in more than 20 countries, and we are very pleased to welcome her here today. Just a quick note, the purpose of the KIDA Innovation Series is designed to inform the public about the latest research and innovation, and this information is for informational and educational purposes.
Hi. Yeah, I will start by actually saying that I do have an accent. So, that's me. I'm originally from Chile, but I have lived here for a long time, but the accent doesn't go away. The first thing that you will notice actually is that the title changed, and I have to thank the KIDA people and Brooke for the patience they have with me, because I changed the title at the last minute. And the reason I changed the title at the last minute was because I was going to be talking about just sensory processing and the research that was behind sensory processing. And then I started moving towards the treatment, and I only had a certain amount of time. I started with like 120 slides, so I needed to change something. And as I was changing, I thought, I think it would be much more interesting to talk about the theory of sensory integration and how is it used in intervention. And this theory of sensory integration uses all of the information about sensory processing. So that's the reason I decided to change the title. So we talk about sensory processing when we're talking about whatever issues that children in general have, or adults, because we all have some sensory processing issues. And we talk about sensory integration as a theory that relates to the sensory issues and is based on the work of Dr. Jean Ayers, and is addressing intervention issues about those sensory processing issues. So maybe if there is a question, you can ask me and I will stop, okay? First, I want to know something about the audience. Let me ask you, how many of you are parents and are not occupational therapists or physical therapists or speech and language therapists? Okay. How many of you are either occupational therapists, physical therapists, or speech and language therapists? Okay. And how many of you are educators, or teachers, or aides, or etc., etc.? Okay. So, if my name, I have to say that too. My name is actually Erna Blanche because I'm actually half Italian. So one of the things, like every Italian, I can be interrupted any moment during the presentation. So if I'm not clear, please feel free to talk it over with me, okay? Okay, let's talk about a little bit about what I'm going to be discussing. I'm going to talk about the impact of sensory processing on daily life. I'm going to be talking about sensory processing issues in children with autism spectrum disorder. And I'm going to talk about sensory integration intervention addressing sensory processing issues. And as I said before, we all have certain characteristics in the way that we process sensory information. And I always give the example of who I am as a person who is processing sensory information. And I am very, very sensitive to tactile input. And actually, I didn't realize how sensitive I was to tactile input until I started studying sensory integration. And how does it show? If somebody comes and approaches me from the back and touches me lightly, I jump. And one time I was at the airport in Los Angeles and I came late and it was an international flight. And somebody from customs approached me from the back and touched me lightly in the back of my hand and I went like this. Okay? And the person thought that I had something to hide. So they took me to a room, separated me from the rest of the people. They searched everything I had. It was not good, okay? So the reaction is an exaggerated reaction to touch. So very often people who are very sensitive to touch have the tendency to have an exaggerated reaction to touch and everything that is around touch, such as brushing teeth, such as eating certain types of food, clothing items. Somebody told me why I was always wearing a certain type of item. And I said, you know, I thought it was because I look good in them. I'm starting to realize it is because the way I feel in those clothing items. And sometimes it is so hidden that these sensory issues are so hidden that parents do not realize that the child is reacting to that type of input rather than just having a temper tantrum or a meltdown. So I always described that when I was little I had long hair, and in order for my mom to comb my hair I had to be playing the piano at the same time because if not she couldn't touch me, okay? So things like that are part of the sensory processing issues and how they impact the way we relate to other people, the way we function, the way we move around, okay? So when we are talking about the impact of sensory processing on behaviors and participation, it definitely will impact attention and engagement. And how is it going to impact attention and engagement? If I am very sensitive or hypersensitive to sensory input, I will be constantly on high alert because I will be careful that nobody comes and touches me from the back or that there is a loud noise or that. So you have that person will always be in high alert and it's hard to attend. So there is some research that shows that children with attention deficit very often are also very sensitive to touch. And it's interesting because I always tell the story that I have 4 children, and one of my kids is relatively, has a motor planning problem, and 2 of my kids are very sensitive to touch and diagnosed with attention deficit. And I always joke around that my 4th child is actually an occupational therapist as well, because she had to treat her siblings. But one of the things that is interesting is that I look at them and the 2 kids that are very tactily defensive or very sensitive to touch are also considered to have a diagnosis of attention deficit. So that relationship is in the literature and it's a relationship that is quite common. And also the impact of sensory processing is on learning and academic performance. Because children that are not able to process certain information, visual, and we talk about also movement, they might be children that are also reversing letters, reversing the perceptual input that they're getting. And actually, Gineas, when she did her research early on, the first diagnostic category in which she found that there was a relationship to sensory processing was with children with learning disabilities. So it's something that has been established for a while. Motor planning is the ability to move with ease, to move in a coordinated way. And motor planning has a lot to do with imitation, with copy. Motor planning is the ability, if I say to you, for example, I want you to do exactly what I am doing, and I do this, you probably would be able to copy it. But in order to do that, you have to get information from your own body and be able to imitate what I am doing, but you need to know your body. First, you need to see that I put one hand here, the other one over here, okay? Second, you need to integrate that I actually crossed my body movement and I went in different directions, okay? Third, you need to feel where your body is, because in order for me to put my hand here, I need to know where my hand is, and that is what we talk about, the sense of proprioception, or the sense that comes from our muscles, correct? So all of that is required, and children who do not process that information adequately, and we will talk about that a little bit later too, will have problems with copying, with imitating gestures. I mean, if I go like this, and you are learning to copy from what I am doing or imitating what I'm doing, it's called, and you do not feel exactly where the muscles in your face are or how they're moving, it's going to be hard to copy and imitate. Then also rigid or inflexible behaviors, repetitive verbalizations, visual stereotypes, abnormal focus affection, are also impacted by sensory processing. And we are going to be talking in a little while about historically how this is established. And it was established by people not in sensory integration. It was at first established by people who were working in behavioral analysis. And what they were looking at is a lot of children who were at that time diagnosed with autism, who had some repetitive behaviors such as rocking, okay, or such as doing something with the hands, tapping the table, and they were looking at if that was in some way related to seeking a certain type of sensory input. And by the way, all of us tend to seek certain types of sensory input when we are stressed. Some of us run, some of us, some of us run, some of us chew our nails, some of us eat too much, and very often, some of us, when we are really stressed, go into the shower and get the hot water going on our body, and all of those things we are looking at for them because they help us regain our sense of self, so bring us back to what we call the optimal level of arousal. Well, children do not have the options we have of saying, I'm going and take a shower right now. Sometimes they don't have the language. And then they look at different ways, maybe not consciously, or they engage in different behaviors that will provide them that input that they're seeking for a number of reasons. And one of them can be that they are stressed, okay? So, as you can imagine, all of this will impact self-care. The parents very often do not understand why the children do not want to wear certain clothing, or why they don't want to brush their teeth with a specific toothbrush, or why there is certain food that they don't want to eat. So, and if the kid has motor planning problems, it's going to also impact the self-dressing. Putting a jacket on, you need to be able to motor plan. Brushing your teeth, you need to motor plan in order to put your toothbrush in the back, etc., etc. Play choices is going to definitely contribute to. And there are children, when we are looking at how the child plays, is when we really realize what is the child choosing when he is totally left by himself to do something that he cares about. It's the same with us, by the way. When we choose something freely is when we really show in there what is it what we are all about and what sensory input we're looking for. So a child who tends to like swings and be on a swing for a long period of time, and I remember one child in particular that I went to the school one time, and the kid they went out into the playground, and the only thing he did was go on the swing and twirl it around and then make it go around, and then twirl it around and make it go around. And the teachers were not clear why was this going on. And of course, the kid was doing this because it was a way of giving himself movement sensation, or what we call vestibular input. So if a child is under-responsive to that input, that kid will be choosing in play those activities that require that. The same as the child who tends to rock. The child might be rocking because he's stressed, or the child might be rocking because he's seeking that input because he's under-responsive to that type of input. The same as when we do this, or when we bounce our legs, sometimes I'm sure that some of you do this, or when you chew on the pen, etc., etc. Okay? Social participation, these things will influence the way we interact with others, either because we cannot read what's going on, or because we are avoiding a close interaction. Participation in social and in family activities. A lot of the times they find that the families have to reduce some of the activities that they're engaging in because of the sensory issues that the kid might have, and participation in the community. And I go back to myself as somebody who has sensory issues, and I do not go to a restaurant that is very loud. And I actually enter a restaurant that is very loud, and I walk out and I say, no, I'm not going to eat here. But I have the ability to say whoever I am with, I don't want to eat here because I'm going to be in a bad mood for the rest of the day, okay? And sometimes you don't know why you are in a bad mood. You sometimes don't realize that what is happening is that it is too much noise, that there is too much lights, that there is too much of something. And that happens to me, who I'm pretty conscious of what I'm doing sensory-wise, and I'm teaching sensory integration. So you can imagine a child who is brought into a situation in which there is too much noise, there are too many lights, the artificial lights. I mean, I can't take them. I mean, I generally lecture without the lights on because they drive me crazy. Okay, so but a kid cannot do that. The kid cannot say that they don't have the language. And actually, most of the time, they don't know what is bothering them. They just get into a temperamental, and they are meltdown, and they don't know why. And it definitely is going to influence the participation in the community. This is, and I think that the occupational therapists that I am, probably most of the parents who are here, they know this, but I do need to say this because for the people who are not that familiar with this. This is the original diagram that described the theory of sensory integration that was by Jean Ayers. And what she actually said was that we have the sensory system, auditory, clear, vestibular is the sense of movement, okay, proprioception, the muscles, touch, and visual, and that these systems influence certain functions. And for example, eye movement, posture control, balance, muscle tone, gravitational security, I'm just reading some of them, sucking, eating, etc. Body percept, coordination of two sides of the body, motor plan, eye-hand coordination, and we then have the end products that you can read there, correct? So what does the theory say? This theory is saying that if you have a problem in the way this information is being processed, it is going to impact those functions that it affects. And I always give the example of postural control because postural control is really clear. If I am not able to figure out that I'm moving in space, I'm not going to adjust my posture and I'm going to fall, correct? So that one is a clear one. Or sucking and eating with touch. If I'm not processing that information adequately, I might gag, or I might choose not to eat certain things. So it's just the theory in a diagram, okay? So the sensory processing issues in children with autism, we have historical data that has been supporting that for a long time. And the historical data talked about the presence of vestibular processing disorders. And these were people at UCLA in the early 70s, and actually the late 60s, that they were already talking about how children with autism exhibited problems in the way they process vestibular information. And vestibular information is a receptor in the ear. Every time we move our head and our body and react gravity, that receptor is going to be functioning. And what they said is that that this type of processing affected sleep, affected the way we perceive the movement, affected motor performance, and that it affected maybe self-stimulation. That in those years they were calling them self-stimulatory or a typical type of behaviors that they thought that it might be affecting them. And actually, what was done later, and that was done then later by the theory of sensory integration and by Gineas, this was the 80s, was to use vestibular input in order to affect language acquisition in children with autism and eye contact. And there was a number of research studies that were done in the 80s that looked at eye contact and language acquisition, vocalizations, okay, with increased vestibular input. I mean, and that's the reason that we use swings, etc., etc. I can talk a little bit more about that, okay? But as you can see, there's a line of research that has been around for many years, that has been continued and moved around. I mean, like the lens with which we look at it changes a little bit, but it's the same. Yeah.
How does it affect sleep?
You know, I am not 100% sure what is the mechanism. I'm just saying they talked about affecting sleep. And when you look at children, and this is anecdotal, okay? This is no research based, okay? No, there hasn't been a study done on this, okay? But, and I think maybe we should, by asking the parents to bring this to therapy, is that children that go through sensory integration intervention, sometimes at the very beginning of the intervention, it affects their sleep. And it affects their sleep sometimes in the positive, sometimes not always in the positive. Okay, but it's at the very beginning and then it changes. Okay, then it goes away. Okay. I can tell anecdotal things about that. When I started studying sensory integration and I would get on the swings with the kids, I didn't understand why I drank more. I think that that's the relationship we were talking about. Yeah. Okay. But the anecdotal, again, that part is anecdotal, okay? Yeah. Then there are autobiographies, and I don't need to talk to you about Temple Grandin, but Temple Grandin started talking about this very early on in the 80s, and she was talking about hyperresponsiveness to vestibular input. And for me, that piece in the first couple of chapters of Emergence Labeled Autism, in which she says that she was sitting in the back of the car wearing, she was like 5 years old and she had never talked it ever before, and she was wearing this little hat and she wanted to take it off, and the mom didn't want her to take it off, and she started opening the window. I don't know if you remember this section, okay? And she started opening the window, and finally she opened the window, took the hat off and threw it out the window, and the mom tries to stop her, and when the mom tries to stop her, she goes against a tree and they crash against a tree. And the glass of the windows breaks and falls down, and Temple says, ice. And it was the first, I mean, the glass, correct? It looked like ice. It was the first word she talked about, she spoke. And what is interesting about that piece is, was it that vestibular, that strong vestibular input that she got with the crashing of the car, which was not good, that made her at that point say a word. And very often we see it with the kids that we treat, that sometimes the child is on the swing and something happened with the swing, something that should not have happened, like maybe the rope breaks and the kid flies and falls down, and the kid then is fascinated by this because he finally has gotten the amount of input that he needs in order to make some meaning for the child, because many of the children tend to be a little bit hyper. I'm not saying we need to break the rules of our swings, but yeah. Tito Mao, and I don't know how to pronounce that, who is another one who talks also, and his book is fascinating because he talks about the sense of proprioception, and he talks about how he doesn't, when he looks at he has autism, I'm sure you know who he is, and that when he looks at the shadow, okay, because he doesn't have a sense of proprioception of his muscles, he feels that his body is out there, that it doesn't belong him, that his body is all of a sudden out there. And he explains that he does this because then he feels that his body is his, and that his hands belong to him. So something that is very interesting. There's also a study that was done with 16 autobiographies and 5 interviews of people diagnosed with ASD, and all of them describe in some way or another sensory processing issues. There's also evidence of psychophysiological data, especially electrodermal responses that look at arousal and response to sensory input. And very often what they see is that if there is an increase in arousal, there will be an increase also in the response to sensory and vice versa. So other studies that have been done, there are a lot of clinical studies in which they have used parent questionnaires, and those are the most common studies that I've seen in the literature. They use parent questionnaires, and they have seen that 90%, at least some people say 90, other studies say 93, others say 89, depends on the group in which the study was done, but the number is always pretty high. It's always around 90% of the children with autism seem to have some type of sensory processing difficulty. And you probably know there's a study that was done by Erna with the first birthday, and she talks about how the early signs of sensory processing are present even before the diagnosis is done. And we have done some of that research at Therapy West, in which we have looked at children prior to their diagnosis by giving them a questionnaire to the parents, and we see that there are differences in the way that the kids are processing the information, and this is in children after 2 years of age. Okay? Hyperreactivity is something that is seen very often. What are the other problems that we see, and how is it going to impact? Sensory processing will impact ideation. Ideation is the ability to come up with new ways of engaging with the world. Ideation is figuring out that if I see a swing, even if the swing is not exactly like the one that I have always seen, it looks like a swing and I can climb on the swing. It's not something that is totally novel. Children without problems, when they go into our sessions, they go on a scooter board because they have seen something with wheels, and they just climb on it and use it because it brings the memory of their scooter board outside. It's not something novel. And that's what ideation is all about. It's about having novel and flexible ways of interacting with the objects in the world. Imitation of gestures and with objects, and we know that imitations of gestures and with objects is something that is effective in children with ASD. Motor planning, as I said before. Execution, which is not the major problem of motor abilities, just plain motor abilities, not the major problem in children with autism, but postural control, which is also related to sensory processing, could be a problem. You have a summary table there, and you have in that summary table what are the types of dysfunctions that they can have: hyperreactive, hyperreactive, hypo and hyper in the same kid, that it fluctuates, and integration of the input. And these are the things that it's going to affect. It's going to affect arousal level, it's going to affect motor planning, etc., etc. Okay, just a summary. So children with ASD have difficulties with imitation very often. Deficit in imitation will impact ideation, social interactions, and learning. and deficits in motor learning will affect their ability to learn through imitation. And I'm focusing on imitation because it's almost like an end product, and it's very present in children with autism, and it's very related to sensory process. So we use the sensory experiences in the intervention process, and we are going to actually show you also a video in a little while. And how do we show? What are the basic principles of sensory integration intervention? When we talk